The pit garage was loud. Engines barking, riders bragging, the sharp smell of scorched rubber and race fuel hanging in the desert heat. In the corner sat a quiet man in a faded gray hoodie and twice-resoled boots, sipping a paper cup of coffee, bothering no one at all. Most people never even noticed him, until one cocky young racer did. "Hey, old-timer." The champion laughed and pointed. "You lost? This is a closed event. You'd hurt yourself out there." A few riders chuckled right along with him. The old man didn't flinch. He just kept tightening his gloves, slow and steady, and said nothing at all. Because that quiet man in the corner wasn't a tourist who'd wandered in off the highway. He was about to walk over to the fastest, most expensive machine in that building. The one the champion's entire crew had been fighting all morning and couldn't fix. And in 7 seconds, he was going to show every single person there exactly who they had been laughing at. And before the hour was out, the same young man who mocked him wouldn't be able to look a single soul in the eye. If you believe the most important people rarely announce themselves, that the ones truly worth respecting almost never demand it, take a second right now to subscribe and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Because today, you're about to meet one. The morning Tyler Brandt decided to humiliate a stranger, the air at Willow Springs already smelled of scorched rubber and high-octane fuel. It was 8:42 in the morning, the sun barely over the Rosamond Hills, and the high desert light came in low and gold and hard, the way it does before the heat arrives and flattens everything. The private track day had drawn the kind of crowd that measured a man by the price of his machine. Tyler stood by the pit wall in a leather suit that cost more than most of the mechanics there made in a month. And he looked across the paddock at the older man in the gray hoodie and the cracked leather pants. And he laughed. "Hey, old-timer," Tyler called out, loud enough for the 11 people nearest him to turn. "You lost? Swap meets 2 exits back." A few of the younger riders chuckled. The old man didn't. He just kept tightening the strap on a worn pair of gloves, slow and unhurried, like a man who had done it 10,000 times and had nowhere better to be. He didn't look up. He didn't flush. He simply pulled the second glove snug, flexed his fingers once, turned his wrist to test the leather across the knuckles, and set his helmet on the workbench beside him with a quiet click. The whole motion took maybe 4 seconds. It carried more composure than the entire row of expensive bikes behind him. He didn't know it yet, but the name on the registration papers for the motorcycle he was about to ride would, within the hour, empty the laughter out of every throat in that garage. Willow Springs International Raceway sits in the high desert north of Los Angeles, a 2.5-mile ribbon of cracked asphalt that has chewed up faster men than Tyler Brandt. They call it the fastest road in the West, and they don't mean it as a compliment so much as a warning. The track has no runoff to speak of in the quick corners. It punishes hesitation, and it punishes arrogance in roughly equal measure, and it has been doing both since 1953. On a private track day, the place becomes a temple to a particular kind of pride. The entry fee was $1,800 for the day. Paid in advance, no refunds. There were 41 riders signed up, though only about half had shown for the early session. The bikes lined up against the pit wall were not transportation. They were trophies, custom builds and limited editions, and one-off prototypes worth more than the houses some of the spectators had grown up in. There was a carbon-framed superbike near the gate with a price tag north of $200,000, and nobody in that paddock blinked at any of it. The smell of the place was money and gasoline, and the particular ozone tang of machinery pushed to its limit, and the people who belonged there breathed it like it was theirs by birthright. Tyler belonged to that world the way a man belongs to a thing he is terrified of losing. At 26, he was the reigning regional champion of the West Coast Amateur Circuit. 3 years running, with a wall of trophies in his garage at home and a sponsorship deal he reminded people about roughly every 15 minutes. His leathers were custom-tailored. His helmet was airbrushed with his name in chrome script across the back. He moved through the paddock the way the sun moves across the desert. Like everything beneath it existed to be warmed by his attention. People made room for him. They handed him cold drinks. They laughed at his jokes a half-second before the punchline landed, which is the surest sign a man has stopped being questioned. He had not been questioned in a long time. So when the quiet man in the old hoodie walked in alone, no entourage, no team, no logo on his back, no chrome on his helmet, Tyler felt something he couldn't quite name, and he covered it the way he covered everything, with noise. The quiet man's name was Keanu Reeves. He had arrived the way he arrived everywhere, which is to say without ceremony. He'd driven up in an old pickup that had 200-some thousand on the clock, parked it at the far end of the lot, where the gravel petered out into desert scrub, and walked in carrying nothing but a helmet under one arm and a small canvas bag in the other hand. His hoodie was gray and faded at the cuffs, the drawstrings frayed where his hands had worried them over the years. His leather pants were genuinely old, scuff and white at the knees from real use, not bought distressed off a rack. His boots had been resoled at least twice. You could see the line where the new sole met the old leather, a thin seam of honest repair. He had not shaved in 3 or 4 days, and his dark hair was tied back loose, and if you didn't know his face, and in that low early light, with the desert sun behind him, half the crowd didn't. You would have taken him for a mechanic who'd wandered in before his shift. He stopped at the coffee station near the timing tower. A kid of maybe 19, a track volunteer in a faded orange safety vest, was wrestling with the big steel urn, jiggling the spout that always stuck, and Keanu waited his turn without complaint. When the kid finally got it flowing and handed over a paper cup with an apologetic grimace, Keanu took it and said, "Thank you. That's exactly what I needed." Just that. He looked the boy in the eye when he said it, the way people forget to do. The kid blinked, surprised to be spoken to like a person instead of an obstacle, and Keanu gave him a small nod and carried his coffee to a quiet corner near the far end of the garage, where there was an old wooden bench and a view of the track and nobody to bother him. He sat. He wrapped both hands around the cup. He watched the first riders trickle out onto the asphalt, and he was, to all appearances, the least important person in the building. That was the whole of it. A man, a coffee, a quiet corner. Nobody worth a second look, or so they all thought. Tyler watched him from across the paddock and decided, in the careless way that men like Tyler decide things, that this stranger was beneath him, and that saying so out loud would be good for a laugh and good for the morning, and good, somehow, for the thing inside him that needed feeding. What Tyler didn't know, what almost nobody at Willow Springs knew that morning, was why Keanu had become the kind of man who learned engines and roads with his own 2 hands. To understand that, you'd have to understand Tyler first. You'd have to understand the strange, sad mirror the two of them were about to hold up to each other in the back of a desert garage. Because the cruelty Tyler was about to aim at the quiet man had nothing to do with the quiet man at all. Tyler Brandt had not always belonged to this world. He had been built by a man who never once set foot in it. Tyler's father, Raymond, had run a 2-bay garage off Sierra Highway, 40 minutes south. The kind of place where the heat lamp over the workbench buzzed all day, and the coffee was always burnt, and the calendar on the wall was 3 years out of date, because nobody ever thought to change it. Raymond Brandt could not have afforded a single track day at Willow Springs if he'd saved for a year. He drove a truck older than the one his son would one day drive, and he wore the same brown coveralls until the knees gave out, and he had hands that no amount of scrubbing ever got fully clean. But he could rebuild a carburetor blind, in the dark by feel, and he had taught his son to do the same. He'd taught him on a cold concrete floor, the two of them on their knees in the glow of a droplight. Raymond with a flashlight clamped in his teeth, and his son holding the parts in small, careful hands. And he had said the same thing, over and over, so many times that it had worn a groove in the boy. A machine tells you the truth if you bother to listen. Other men lie. Other men flatter. But a machine just tells you what's wrong, plain and patient, and waits for you to be smart enough to hear it. Raymond Brandt died of a heart attack at 51 on a Tuesday, 3 weeks before Tyler's first amateur race, with grease still under his fingernails and a half-finished brake job still up on the lift. He never saw his son win anything. He never saw the trophies, the sponsorship, the custom leathers, the chrome script on the helmet. Tyler won that first race for him, and the next one, and the one after that. And somewhere along the way, climbing hand over hand toward a world his father had only ever looked at from the far side of a chain-link fence, Tyler had started to be ashamed. Ashamed of the cold garage, ashamed of the burnt coffee, ashamed of the brown coveralls and the Reeves boots and the truck that wouldn't start in the cold. He had started measuring people by the exact things he used to lack. Because the surest way to convince yourself you've escaped a place is to look down on the people still standing in it. And every single time he saw a man in worn leather and scuffed boots, some old animal fear closed its hand around his chest and squeezed, and he made it stop the only way he knew how. He made someone else feel smaller, and the fear for a little while would loosen its grip. So he crossed the paddock now, toward the quiet man on the bench, grinning the grin that always got a laugh. And he went to make the fear stop one more time. "Seriously, man," Tyler said, planting himself in front of Keanu's corner so that his shadow fell across the bench. "This is a closed event. Riders and crew only." "You crew for somebody?" Keanu looked up from his coffee. His eyes were calm, dark, unhurried, the eyes of a man who had been looked at by far harder things than a 26-year-old with something to prove. "Just here to ride," he said. That got a bigger laugh from the 4 or 5 guys who'd drifted over to watch, smelling sport. Tyler glanced down at the old hoodie, the cracked pants, the twice-resoled boots, and let his grin widen until it showed teeth. "Ride what? You bring a moped?" He swept an arm toward the row of 6-figure machines gleaming against the pit wall. "These are real bikes, old-timer. This is a real track. You'd hurt yourself out there. Do everybody a favor and stick to the parking lot." Keanu didn't answer right away. He took a slow sip of his coffee. He set the cup down on the bench beside him, squared it carefully so it wouldn't tip, and looked up at Tyler with an expression that was neither angry, nor wounded, nor afraid. It was something quieter than all of those. It was something almost like patience. The patience of a man who has learned that most cruelty is just fear wearing a louder shirt, and that you cannot argue a frightened man out of being frightened. "Maybe," Keanu said, and then he said nothing else at all. There is a particular kind of silence a man gives you when he refuses to fight on your terms. And Keanu gave Tyler that silence now, full and unbothered and complete, and it did something strange to the air in that corner of the garage. The guys who'd come to watch the old-timer get embarrassed shifted their weight from foot to foot. The joke had landed. It had, but it hadn't bounced back the way jokes are supposed to, hadn't given Tyler the satisfying crack of a return volley. In the dead space where the stranger's anger was supposed to be, where his stammering defense or his red-faced retreat was supposed to be, there was only a man drinking coffee and watching the track, entirely at peace, as if Tyler had not spoken at all. And that silence is exactly where the people watching always see themselves. Because every one of them, somewhere, sometime, had been the one in the worn boots. Every one of them had stood in front of someone louder and richer and crueler, and swallowed a laugh they couldn't return. They watched the quiet man not answer, and some old bruise of their own pressed up against the surface, and the morning began, very quietly, to turn. From a few yards away, an older man had been watching the whole thing, with his arms crossed and his eyes narrowed against the glare. His name was Frank Mercer, and he had owned and run track operations at Willow Springs for 22 years. Frank was 63 years old, built like an old fence post that had outlasted 3 fences, with a gray mustache gone yellow at the edges from a habit he'd quit a decade ago, and forearms scarred from 4 decades around fast machinery and the men who rode it. He had seen every kind of rider come through those gates. The gifted, the reckless, the merely rich, the genuinely doomed. And he had developed the sense that old hands develop, a sense that lives somewhere below thought, for which men actually knew what they were doing, and which men only badly needed everyone to think they did. Frank looked at the quiet man on the bench for a long, considering moment. He'd seen something at the gate that morning, on the registration clipboard, a name that had made him stop and look twice and then keep his mouth shut, because keeping his mouth shut was a thing Frank Mercer was very good at. Now he ambled over, his bad knee giving him a slight roll, leaned in close to Tyler, and said quietly, "Just for him, son. You might want to slow down." Tyler waved him off without even turning his head. "I got this, Frank." Frank held his gaze on Keanu a second longer. Keanu met his eyes, and something passed between the two older men. Not recognition, exactly, but a kind of mutual understanding, the silent freemasonry of people who have spent their whole lives near engines and have nothing left to prove to anyone, least of all to a boy in custom leathers. Frank gave a small nod, almost an apology on the kid's behalf, and stepped back. "All right," Frank said. But he didn't walk away. He drifted to the edge of it and stayed there, arms crossed, watching, because 22 years had taught him to recognize the particular charge in the air that comes right before a morning stops being ordinary. He did not intend to miss whatever came next, what Frank Mercer didn't say, what he wouldn't say to anyone until much later, and even then only with a smile and a shrug, was that he'd known whose name was on that clipboard since 7:15 that morning, and that he had been quietly, patiently looking forward to this exact moment for the better part of 2 hours. The morning wore on the way track mornings do, in sessions and breaks, in the rise and fall of engine noise, in the smell of hot brake pads and the squint of riders reading their lap times off the tower. Keanu finished his first coffee and didn't get a second. He stayed on the bench, and he watched the way most people never bother to watch anything. Completely, with his whole attention, as if the track and the bikes and the riders were a book everyone else had mistaken for a wall. He noticed things. He noticed the way one rider's machine pushed wide and unhappy through turn 2, fighting its own front end, the rider clearly muscling it where he should have been trusting it. He noticed the way another bike's exhaust note flattened out under load, just a fraction, in a high corner, a tiny lean mixture stumble that the rider hadn't caught and probably never would. He noticed which riders trusted their tires and which ones were lying to themselves about it. He sat very still and he took it all in, and nobody paid him any mind at all, because the most invisible thing in the world is a quiet man in old clothes who isn't asking for anything. He noticed, most of all, the bike that Tyler's crew kept rolling in and out of the garage with worried faces and lowered voices. It was a genuinely stunning machine. It wore the bright colors of Tyler's main sponsor, a build sheet's worth of the finest components money could buy, and it was supposed to be the fastest single thing on the entire property that day. But it was not running right, and everyone in Tyler's pit knew it, and none of them could say why. Tyler had taken it out twice and come back both times nearly 2 full seconds off his own personal best lap, which at this level is not a small thing. It is an eternity, a humiliation measured in tenths. His crew had spent the better part of 70 minutes feast swarming the machine with laptops and torque wrenches and tire pyrometers, adjusting the rear shock, then the compression, then the rebound, then the ride height, then changing it all back, and getting precisely nowhere. The bike fought the rider in the fast corners. It wandered under heavy braking, like a shopping cart with a bad wheel. And the harder the crew chased it, the further away the answer seemed to get. By 11:15, Tyler's good mood had curdled all the way through into something mean and frightened, which in a man like Tyler are usually the same thing. He came off the track after his third session, swung off the bike before it had fully stopped, and ripped his helmet off so hard the chin strap left a red welt under his jaw. He threw a glove at the pit wall hard enough that it skidded under a tool cart and stayed there. "It's the bike," he snapped at his lead engineer, loud, his voice cracking up an octave. "Something's wrong with the bike. I'm doing my part. Fix the bike." The crowd had grown by now. The mid-morning session break had pulled 30 or 40 people, drifting toward Tyler's pit, drawn by the unmistakable music of a champion coming apart at the seams. And Tyler, who had always known how to turn a bad moment into a performance, how to make his own failure into someone else's fault in front of an audience, caught sight of the quiet man still sitting calmly on his own bench in the corner, and saw, with a sick flash of relief, a way to win the morning back. "You know what?" Tyler said, and he turned, and he raised his voice so that the whole paddock could hear it bounce off the metal roof. "Hey, old-timer." He pointed across the garage at Keanu, and 40 heads turned to follow the line of his arm. "You've been sitting there all morning with your coffee like you're some kind of expert. Watching everybody. Judging. You think you could do better? Huh?" He spread his arms wide, playing to the crowd. "You think you belong out there?" The paddock went still. People turned all the way around now. Drinks halfway to mouths, phones half raised. This was theater, and they all knew it, and they all leaned in. Keanu set his empty cup down on the bench, and he stood up. He didn't square his shoulders, or puff out his chest, or do any of the things a man does when he's about to make a point. He just stood, unhurried, the way he did everything, and he walked. He walked toward Tyler, and toward the troubled, beautiful, expensive machine, and the crowd parted to let him through. Not because anyone told them to, but because crowds always part for a man who is moving with that particular unbothered certainty, sensing, even before they understand it, that the ground has just shifted somewhere beneath their feet. What happened in the next 90 seconds, not one person in that garage would ever forget for the rest of their lives. Keanu stopped beside the bike. He didn't reach out and grab it, didn't make a show, didn't put his hands all over it the way the crew had been doing for an hour. He crouched down instead, slow and careful, his bad-weather knees popping audibly, and he looked at the front end of the machine the way Frank Mercer had earlier watched him be looked at. With the patient, total attention of a man, listening for the one true thing the machine was trying to say. He looked for maybe 7 seconds. 7 seconds of silence, the whole paddock holding its breath. Then he stood back up, slow, and said quietly, almost gently, "Your triple clamp offset is wrong." Tyler's lead engineer looked up from her laptop with open, weary irritation. Her name was Grace Whitman. She was 38 years old, with 11 years of professional racing experience across 2 continents, a mechanical engineering degree she'd paid for herself, and exactly 0 patience left this morning for paddock spectators who fancied themselves experts. She had been wrestling this bike since dawn. The last thing she needed was a man in a thrift store hoodie with an opinion. "Excuse me?" she said. "The offset," Keanu said again. "No edge to it, no triumph. Somebody swapped the triple clamps when they rebuilt the front end. The offset's wrong, so your trail's too short. That's why it's nervous under braking and won't settle into the fast corners. The front's too quick, too eager. It won't hold a steady line because the geometry's fighting itself. It's not the suspension. You've been chasing the suspension all morning, and the suspension was never the problem." Grace stared at him. Around her, the entire crowd had gone dead still, the kind of stillness that has a temperature, a held breath, waiting to find out whether the stranger had just made a complete fool of himself or done something far stranger and harder to forgive, because Grace Whitman knew engines. And she knew, the instant the words left his mouth, that there was a very real chance he was right. The symptoms fit. They fit perfectly. Fit better than anything she'd considered in 70 minutes of laptop work, and the fact that a man in a faded gray hoodie had seen in 7 seconds what her entire crew had missed in over an hour was not a thing she was anywhere near ready to accept. "That's not," she started. "Check the part number," Keanu said. Not a challenge. If anything, it sounded like an apology, like he was sorry to be putting her through it. "I could be wrong. I'm not trying to embarrass anybody. But check the part number on the clamp, and you'll know in 30 seconds. Grace held his eyes for a long moment, weighing him. And then, because she was a real engineer, and not a proud one, because somewhere under the irritation, she had built her whole career on the principle that the machine and not her ego, got the final word. She set down her laptop, knelt at the front of the bike, and pulled out her phone to check the part number stamped into the triple clamp. The silence stretched. 11 seconds. 12. Tyler, who had crossed his arms and braced himself to enjoy the spectacle of the old man being proven a fraud, frowned and shifted his weight. "Grace, it's fine, right? Just tell him it's fine, and let's move on." Grace didn't answer. She read the number. She typed it into her phone. She scrolled. And she went very, very still, the way a person goes still when the floor they were sure of turns out to be a trapdoor. "Grace," Tyler said again, lower now. "The clamps are wrong," Grace said quietly. She stayed crouched at the front of the bike for another second, then rose to her feet and looked at Keanu. And something in her face had completely, utterly changed. The irritation was gone. In its place was something closer to awe, and underneath the awe, the faint, cold horror of a professional who has just been shown a thing she should have caught herself. Somebody installed the wrong offset spec when the front end got rebuilt last month. 30mm instead of 25. He's right. He's exactly right. That's the whole problem. That's everything. The paddock made a sound, not a gasp, but a low collective shift. 40 people moving an inch closer all at once, a single animal leaning in. Tyler's face did something complicated and painful to watch. The grin was long gone. In its place was the slow, sick, dawning suspicion that he had picked, of all the men in the world, the exact wrong one to laugh at this morning. "That's a lucky guess," Tyler said. But his voice had lost every bit of its edge, and he knew it, and so did everyone listening. Keanu didn't argue. He never argued. That was the thing about him that the morning was only beginning to understand. He just looked at the bike, and then at the long, empty stretch of track shimmering in the rising heat, and then back over at Frank Mercer, who had come to stand at the front of the crowd now with his arms crossed, and the faintest ghost of a smile moving under his yellowed-gray mustache. "Mind if I take it out?" Keanu asked. "Once it's back to spec, I'd like to feel it for myself, make sure that's the only thing wrong with it." And Frank Mercer, who had been waiting 2 patient hours for exactly these words, said, "Be my guest." It took Grace and her crew 19 minutes to pull the wrong triple clamps and install the correct ones, and dial the whole front end back to spec. Keanu waded through it, the way he waded through everything. Quietly, off to one side, declining the folding chair a sheepish crew member dragged over for him, standing instead with his helmet held loose under his arm and his eyes on the work. He watched Grace's hands move. Once, when a younger mechanic started to over-torque a pinch bolt, Keanu said, mildly, "Little less than that," and the kid checked his wrench and found he'd been about to crush the thing, and shot the stranger a look of pure startled gratitude. Tyler hovered at the edge of his own pit through all 19 minutes. No longer performing, no longer playing to anyone. Watching the quiet man with a wariness that had completely replaced the morning's contempt. He didn't know what to do with his hands. He kept opening his mouth to say something, and finding nothing in there worth saying. When the bike was finally ready, Grace rolled it forward and stepped back, and Keanu pulled his old helmet on, fastened the strap with 2 fingers, swung a leg over the machine, and thumbed it to life. The engine settled into a clean, even idle. He rolled out onto pit lane, without a single word, without a glance at Tyler, without so much as a nod to the crowd. And then, for a few minutes, the man in the old hoodie reminded everyone at Willow Springs what they had forgotten they'd come to see. He didn't rev it for the crowd as he left pit lane. He didn't snap the throttle, or lift the front wheel, or do any of the small, loud things that riders do when they want to be looked at. He simply eased out onto the track, gentle and unhurried through the first 2 corners, getting the feel of the machine underneath him, letting the tires come up to temperature, asking the bike a few quiet questions, and listening for the answers. From the pit wall it looked, almost, like nothing. Like an old man taking it easy. The crowd drifted to the wall to watch anyway. Tyler came to and stood at the rail, with his arms folded and his jaw set, and Grace came and stood beside him with her stopwatch, forgotten in her hand. And then, on his third lap, the quiet man stopped being quiet. It is a hard thing to describe to anyone who has never stood at a racetrack and seen it happen. What it looks like when a person who genuinely, deeply knows how to ride takes a difficult machine around a difficult track. The strange part is that it does not look fast, not at first. It looks calm. It looks, almost, slow, the way a great dancer makes a hard thing look like the easiest thing in the world. The rider and the machine seem to have come to some private agreement, a quiet contract about exactly where the grip is and precisely how much of it there is to spend, and not one drop more. Keanu flowed through turn 2. That long, fast, terrifying, off-camber right-hander that has put more riders into the gravel and the hospital than any other corner on the property. With a smoothness that made the whole impossible thing look gentle, look unhurried, look like something a man might do on a quiet Sunday morning, purely for the love of it. There was no drama in it, there was no fighting. The bike that had wandered and bucked and embarrassed a champion all morning long now turned underneath him like it had been waiting its whole life for someone to stop arguing with it. It was not gentle. What it was control so absolute and so complete that it had circled all the way back around to looking like Grace. The pit wall went silent. Grace Whitman stood with the stopwatch in her hand and entirely forgot to look at it, because the tower would tell the story better than she could. He crossed the line, and the timing tower flashed his lap up in red digits, 8 feet tall, and there was a sound from the crowd like all the air going out of a room at once. He was a second and 7/10 faster than Tyler's best lap of the entire day. On the same machine. On his third lap out. On a bike he had never sat on in his life until 20 minutes ago. He didn't push for another fast one. He rolled around once more at 3/4 pace, cooling the tires, feeling the front end settle, and stay settled exactly where he'd predicted it would. And then he eased the bike down pit lane and brought it to a smooth stop, directly in front of the pit, and shut it down. The engine ticked and pinged as it cooled in the desert heat. For a long moment, in a garage full of 40 people, not one single person moved or spoke. Then Keanu pulled off his helmet, ran a gloved hand back through his loose dark hair, and said, to nobody in particular, in the most ordinary voice in the world, "Yeah, that was the offset. It's a good bike. Whoever spec'd this build knew exactly what they were doing." He looked over at Grace. "Your front end's honest now. It'll hold a line for him all day. He's got nothing to fight anymore." And that was all of it. No victory lap, no fist in the air, no glance over at Tyler to watch him squirm. Not one single word about the lap time still glowing red on the tower behind him, the lap time the entire paddock was still staring at, with its collective jaw on the floor. He swung off the bike, set the helmet down on the tank, and began peeling off his gloves one finger at a time, slow and unbothered, exactly the way he had put them on 3 hours earlier. As if the single most remarkable thing that had happened to him all morning was that the coffee had been hot when he wanted it. The restraint was louder than any boast could ever have been. The not gloating filled the entire garage, wall to wall, and every person in it felt it. It was Frank Mercer who finally broke the silence. Because Frank had earned it. And because Frank had been holding his card close for over 2 hours and had decided the time had come to lay it down. He walked up to the front of the crowd, that bad knee giving him his slight roll, and he looked at the stranger with the deep, quiet satisfaction of a man whose long hunch has just paid off in front of 40 witnesses. "You all want to know who you've been laughing at all morning?" Frank said, and his voice carried clean across the silent garage. He nodded toward the machine, toward the small, understated logo, etched into the side of the fuel tank. The logo nobody had bothered to actually read all day, because who reads the badge on another man's bike? Take a good look at the name on that tank. Read the shop that built this thing. 40 pairs of eyes went to the fuel tank. Grace got there first. She had been staring at that logo all morning without once seeing it. The way you stop seeing a thing that has always simply been in front of you. Now she read it, and she read the small line of text stamped beneath it, and her hand came up slowly to cover her mouth. The motorcycle Tyler had bragged about all morning long. The breathtaking six-figure custom build that was supposed to be the fastest thing on the entire property had been designed and built by the very company the quiet man in the old hoodie had helped to found. His name wasn't lettered across the tank in chrome script. Men like him don't put their names on things in chrome script. But it was on the build sheet folded in the crew's binder. It was on the company's registration. It was, Grace understood now in a single vertiginous rush, the exact reason he had diagnosed that front end in 7 flat seconds. Because he had not been guessing at all. He had recognized a single wrong part on a machine he understood right down to the marrow of it. A machine he had helped dream up and draw out and build, the way a father recognizes, the moment something is wrong with his own child, across a crowded room. Grace started, and found that she could not get the rest of it out. Keanu did not help her finish the sentence. He never named himself, not once, not that whole morning. He just gave her a small, almost embarrassed smile, the slightly pained smile of a man who would genuinely, sincerely have preferred for the entire thing to stay quiet, and he said, "It's a really good build. Your crew should be proud of it once it's set up right. The bones are excellent." And the paddock came apart into sound. Not cheering, exactly. It was far more complicated than cheering. The people who had been quietly, privately uncomfortable with Tyler's cruelty all morning let out a long breath, several of them shaking their heads, a few of them actually laughing out loud in sheer disbelief at the size of what they'd just watched. The people who'd been neutral, who'd watched the whole thing the way you watch weather, stood frozen, eyes going from the badge to the man, to the red lap time on the tower, and back again, trying to make it all fit. And the half-dozen guys who had laughed, the loudest and the meanest at the old-timer in the worn boots, 3 hours ago, went very, very quiet, and could not seem to find anywhere in the entire garage to safely put their eyes. And Tyler Brandt stood in the dead center of all of it. In his custom leathers, with his name in chrome on the helmet hanging from his hand. In front of the gleaming machine that wasn't even really his, and he felt the ground he had stood on his entire adult life tilt and crack and slide quietly out from under him. He had spent the whole morning trying to prove that he belonged. And the quiet man, without ever once raising his voice, without a single cruel word, without even seeming to try, had shown the entire paddock the difference between truly belonging to a thing and merely, desperately needing it to want you. What happened next, Keanu went out of his way to make sure that nobody saw, because this is the part that separates the man Keanu Reeves actually is from the legend that people are always so eager to build around him. He did not stand there and let Tyler Brandt be destroyed in front of 40 people. He had every earthly right to. He had been mocked, twice, loudly, publicly, in front of a crowd, by a man young enough to be his son, for no reason other than the boy's own fear. The easy thing, the satisfying thing, the thing half the crowd was leaning in and quietly hoping for, would have been to turn on his heel and walk out and let Tyler drown alone in the silence he had built for himself. Keanu did not do that. It does not seem to have even occurred to him to do that. Instead, he picked up his small canvas bag, and on his way past Tyler's pit he slowed and stopped and said, low and just for the two of them, under the noise of the crowd, "Hey, can I talk to you for a second? Just us, out back." Tyler, who had braced every muscle for the killing blow, who had been standing there waiting to be finished off in public, blinked at him. And then, not knowing what else in the world to do, he followed the quiet man into the cool, dim back of the garage, where the crowd and the heat and the eyes could not reach them. It was cool back there, and shadowed and quiet, the desert glare cut off by the metal walls. Tool chests stood in a long red row. A scarred wooden workbench held a heavy vise, a battered coffee maker, a coffee can full of odd bolts, and the comfortable scattered debris of a real working garage. A drop light hung dark from a hook. Tyler stood with his arms crossed tight over his chest, defensive, braced, waiting for the lecture he had absolutely earned. The gloat, The slow patient I told you so. Keanu set his bag down on the workbench. He didn't lead with an accusation. He looked at Tyler for a moment in the dim light, and then he asked quietly, "What is this really about?" Tyler's jaw worked. "What do you mean? This morning. The stuff you said to me." Keanu's voice held no anger in it anywhere, none, and that was somehow harder to stand than anger would have been. A man doesn't come at a stranger that hard, that early, over nothing, unless something's pushing him from behind. I've seen it plenty. I've felt it. So I'm just asking you, straight, with nobody else around, what is this actually about? And Tyler Brandt, who had spent 3 solid years building a high, thick wall around the cold garage and the burnt coffee and the brown coveralls and the Reeves boots, discovered, standing there in the dim, that he could not keep the wall standing in front of this particular man. Not this one. Of all the men in the world, not this one. His eyes went, almost against his own will, to a photograph wedged into the lower corner of the dusty mirror over the workbench. Not his photo, just some snapshot a mechanic had left there years ago and never reclaimed. A faded, curling picture of a man and a boy kneeling together beside an old stripped-down bike, both of them grinning, both of them filthy with grease. Tyler looked at it. His throat moved. Something behind his face came loose. "My dad had a garage," Tyler said finally, and the words came out rough and low, like they'd been kept somewhere dark a long time. Off Sierra Highway, 2 bays. A heat lamp over the bench that buzzed all day long drove my mom crazy whenever she came by. He stopped, breathed, started again. He taught me everything I know on a cold concrete floor with a flashlight in his teeth. Never raced a single day in his life. Couldn't have afforded 1 lap of this place if he'd saved a whole year for it. He looked down at his own expensive gloved hands. He died 3 weeks before my first race. Heart attack on a Tuesday. 51 years old. They found him with grease still under his nails and a brake job still up on the lift. Keanu didn't say a word. He just listened, fully, with his whole self, the same way he'd listened to the bike out on the track. The same way, Tyler would realize much later, that he seemed to listen to absolutely everything. "And I won," Tyler went on, the words coming faster now, like a seal had broken. "I won that first one for him, and I kept winning, and I clawed my way all the way up here." He gestured vaguely, helplessly, at the custom leathers, at the gleaming world on the other side of the wall, at the trophies that weren't even in the room. And somewhere in there I started being ashamed of the garage, of the flashlight in his teeth, of the coveralls and the burnt coffee and the truck that wouldn't start. His voice broke clean in half. Of him. I started being ashamed of him, and so I go after guys who look like where I come from. Guys in old boots, guys with grease they can't scrub out. I make them feel small, right out loud in front of everybody, so that for 5 minutes I don't have to feel like that's still me underneath all this. He raised his head, and his eyes were wet and spilling over, and his whole face had become a boy's face again, 26 years old going on 12. "I looked at you this morning, sitting there in that hoodie with your coffee, and I saw my dad. I swear to God I saw him, and I couldn't stand it for 1 second. So I went after you." The back of the garage was very quiet. Out front, muffled by the metal wall, an engine fired up and revved and faded away down pit lane. Keanu was quiet for a long moment. And then he did the thing that he does. The thing that no legend has ever once managed to capture. The thing that is the actual living reason he is who he is. He gave the crying boy something true and costly of his own, freely, without being asked. "I've lost some people too," Keanu said simply, and his voice when he said it was lower than it had been all morning. "People I loved more than anything. A long time ago, and not so long ago. And I'll tell you something nobody tells you. It doesn't get smaller. It just gets quieter. You learn to carry it where it doesn't show." He looked down at his own scarred, grease-stained hands, turning them over in the dim light. "And after, for a long stretch, I didn't much want to be around people. People want things from you, or they're sorry for you, or they want you to be okay so they can stop worrying. So I learned engines instead. I learned roads. I taught myself how machines work, all the way down, because a machine doesn't care who you are. It doesn't care what you've lost, or whether you slept, or whether you're sad enough to barely stand up. It just tells you the plain truth, patient as anything, and waits for you to be quiet enough to hear it. And there is a peace in that, son. There is a real peace in that, when nothing else in your life will hold still. He let that sit in the cool dark between them. I never learned a bit of this to be better than anybody, Keanu said gently. I learned it to have something to hold on to when everything else came loose. Your father gave you that exact thing. On a cold concrete floor, with a flashlight clenched in his teeth, with nothing, he gave you the single best thing anybody ever gave me, and I had to go find it the hard way, alone, years later. He just handed it to you when you were a kid. He nodded toward the resoled boots on Tyler's own feet, the ones the kid had clearly kept and worn, long after he could afford 100 new pairs. Those boots aren't the thing you should be hiding. They're the only thing in this whole gleaming building that's actually truly yours. Everything else out front you can buy. That you can't. Tyler Brandt put one gloved hand over his eyes and stood there in the dim back of the garage, and his shoulders shook, and the regional champion of the West Coast Amateur Circuit, 3 years running, cried like he had not let himself cry since he was a 23-year-old kid standing over a casket. 3 weeks before the biggest race of his young life, holding a trophy in his head that his father would never ever see. Keanu didn't tell him to stop. He didn't look away to spare him, and he didn't crowd him either. He put one steady hand on the kid's shoulder, brief and firm and real, the way Tyler's father used to do it on that cold floor when a bolt wouldn't come loose and the boy wanted to quit, and he let him have it. He let him have the whole thing. When Tyler finally walked back out into the bright clattering noise of the paddock a few minutes later, his eyes were red and swollen, and he did not care one bit who saw it. The crowd had thinned out. The next sessions had started, and the day had moved on the way days always do, indifferent to anybody's reckoning. But a knot of people still lingered near his pit. Grace was there, Frank was there, and so were 2 of the half-dozen guys who had laughed the loudest at the old-timer that morning, standing around now with nothing to say. Tyler did not go to Keanu first. He went, instead, straight to the kid in the orange volunteer vest, the 19-year-old who'd handed the stranger his coffee at the urn, the same kid Tyler had snapped at twice that morning over nothing at all, once about a parking cone and once about a clipboard. "Hey," Tyler said to him, and his voice was steady even though his face wasn't. "I owe you an apology. About this morning. Both times. I was a complete jerk to you, and you didn't do one single thing to deserve it. And the truth is, I was just looking for somebody smaller than me to take it out on. That's the whole reason. That's on me, not you. I'm sorry." The kid stared at him like he had grown a second head right there in the desert heat. And then Tyler turned to the small, lingering crowd, and to Grace, and to Frank, and his voice came out clear even though his eyes were still wet and shining. "I owe a lot of people an apology this morning. But mostly I owe one to the man I spent 3 hours insulting. And here's the thing I need you all to hear. Not because of who he turned out to be." He shook his head, hard, like he was shaking water off it. "If he'd been a nobody. If he'd been some old mechanic who just wandered in off the highway looking for shade, somebody who couldn't ride a lawnmower around a parking lot, I'd have been exactly, precisely as wrong as I was. Because what I said this morning was wrong. Not because of who he is. Because of who I was being when I said it. It was not the apology of a man who had been caught and was scrambling. It was the apology of a man who had been seen all the way down to the bottom and had decided, standing there in front of everyone, to finally stop hiding." Keanu, gathering the last of his things at the far bench, heard every word of it. He gave the smallest nod, almost to himself, and he said nothing at all, because there was nothing left that needed saying, and because he had never in his life wanted the credit for a single second of any of it. In the weeks and months that followed, The story of that morning at Willow Springs traveled the way these stories always do. In pieces, sideways, in the retellings of the 40-odd people who had actually stood there and watched it happen. The lap time got faster every time it was told. The diagnosis got quicker. By autumn, there were 3 or 4 entirely different versions floating around the West Coast paddocks, and Frank Mercer, when asked, refused to confirm any of them. But the part that actually mattered was never the lap time. It was never the badge on the tank, and it was never even the impossible 7-second diagnosis. The part that mattered, the part that lasted, was a 2-bay garage off Sierra Highway, with a buzzing heat lamp over the bench, because Tyler Brandt bought it back. The old shop where his father had taught him on a cold concrete floor had been sitting empty and shuttered. For 3 years, the windows soaped over. A faded for lease sign curling in the desert sun. Tyler took a sizable chunk of his sponsorship money. Money that had been earmarked for a new bike and a fresh set of even more expensive leathers. And he reopened it. He hung the old buzzing heat lamp back over the workbench where it had always been. He fixed the calendar on the wall, then thought about it, and put the 3-year out-of-date one right back up where it had been the day his father died. And then he started teaching, free of charge. 2 evenings a week, every week. Any kid in the valley who wanted to learn how a machine tells you the truth if you bother to listen. He didn't advertise it. He didn't put his name on it. 11 kids signed up the very first month, most of them kids from families that could no more afford a track day than Raymond Brandt ever could. By the end of that first year, there were 3 or 4 more on a waiting list. And the coffee in the old percolator was once again always burnt and always on, exactly the way it was supposed to be. Tyler kept his father's brown coveralls hanging on a nail by the door. He never wore them. He just liked knowing they were there. He still races. He's better at it now than he ever was, which surprised everyone except the one quiet man who would have predicted it. Because it is a strange and reliable truth that a man rides easier once he stops being afraid of the thing chasing him. And Tyler's worst lap times had always come from fear. He won the regional championship again that year, a 4th time. When they handed him the trophy, he thanked his father by name, out loud, in front of everyone, for the first time. Then he drove the trophy straight back to the old garage and set it on a shelf above the workbench, next to the curling photograph of the man, and the boy, and the old stripped-down bike, where his students could see it every evening when they came in to learn. Frank Mercer quietly renamed the long, fast, terrifying right-hander at the top of the circuit. The official maps and the timing system still called it Turn 2, the way they always had since 1953. But everyone who ran Willow Springs after that morning called it something else among themselves, a private name. After the day, a quiet man took it like it was nothing at all, and then turned a cruel, frightened boy into a far better one in the cool dark back of a garage. Frank never told the whole story to the people who came around asking, and plenty of them came around asking. He'd just settle back against the pit wall and smile under his yellowed gray mustache and say, "You had to be there." And then, more often than not, he'd add, quieter mostly to himself, "Best morning I had in 22 years. And Grace Whitman left her job that spring. The quiet man's company called. Or rather, a soft-spoken assistant called on behalf of someone who never made any fuss whatsoever about his own name, and asked whether she might be interested in a senior engineering position, designing and building the exact kind of machines she had spent her entire 11-year career admiring from the outside of the glass. She said yes before the assistant had finished the sentence. She moved north that summer. She is by every account extraordinary at it, and she is happier than she has been in years. She still keeps the part number from that wrong 30mm triple clamp taped to the bottom corner of her monitor, where she sees it every single working day. A small, permanent, humbling reminder that the most dangerous and expensive thing in any garage, in any shop, in any life, is the quiet assumption that you already know. As for Keanu, he never spoke about it. Not once. He never gave an interview about the lap or the diagnosis or the boy crying in the back of the desert garage. The one time, much later, that someone who'd heard a version of the story asked him directly what had really happened that day out at Willow Springs, he just shrugged and looked genuinely a little uncomfortable to be asked about it at all, and said 4 words: "I came to ride." And he still does. Most mornings, if the high desert air is cool and the back roads are empty and the world hasn't found him yet, you might come across an old high-mileaged pickup parked at the far end of some lot where the gravel runs out, and a man in a faded gray hoodie and twice-resoled boots pulling on a worn pair of gloves, alone, in no hurry whatsoever, with absolutely nothing to prove to a single living soul. And if some younger man ever laughs at him, and they still do, now and then, the ones who don't know any better, the ones being chased by something they haven't turned around to look at yet, he doesn't laugh back. He doesn't get angry. He doesn't tell them who he is. He just tightens his gloves and flexes his fingers once and turns his wrist to test the leather across the knuckles and wonders, the way he always quietly wonders, what it is that boy is really so afraid of. So here is the question worth sitting with, long after the engines go quiet. How many people walk right past us every single day in worn-out boots, carrying inside them everything we'd ever need to learn? And how many of them do we decide to laugh at before we ever once bother to stop and listen?